growing up with you. One is that we deal with large families here, and a lot of times there'll be several therapists for several different family members. And it would be natural, but it's not a good idea, to assume that if I'm taking care of one person in the family and someone else is taking care of another person in the family, that we can just talk with each other. That's natural, but it ain't right. It needs to be discussed before you talk to a therapist of another member of the family. Talk to your supervisor first and think through it. There's not always, usually it'll work out, but the way of going through it isn't natural. So what we're asking you to do is, let's say your Aryeh is dealing with one brother and Zalmi is dealing with another brother. It would be natural, since they're sitting beside each other, to talk about the family. That will probably work out, but before it happens, Aryeh talks to his supervisor about it, and Zalmi talks to his supervisor about it, just to run it through another set of thinking, because there's something about it that needs to respect the separation between therapies, and especially if it's true of parents and children or spouses. It's not a done deal. You have to use your supervisor as a second way of thinking about it before you do it. That's the easy part. The other thing is that, as you know, we're engaged in trying to create as much as possible. Well, we'll just give a minute for half of the class here. We're engaged in as much as possible trying to create a cultural setting that, wait a minute. When we have chairs that moves quietly, we're trying to create an environment where each and every one of you is completely comfortable within the cultural context of being Charedim. Now, there's different ways of being Charedi, and there are different kinds of experiences. And what we want to do is to try to figure out how it works for everybody. In other words, we don't want things to intrude in an area that's uncomfortable. And the one place that that's happened, and it's probably our oversight that we haven't mentioned it, there were two libraries. The reason there are two libraries is that the convenient library on the ground floor, which is natural to use all the time, that is the women's library. That's not the common library, it's the women's library. And the library upstairs, which has the same computer capacity, is for the men. It's a big mechitza, it's a different floor, it's far away. But what we want to try to do is to keep the ground floor library as much as possible free of the presence of men. Free of the presence of men. So there are times when you'll need to go in and do something or other and come out. If you want a book, God willing, somebody someday will want a book. So you go to the library and you find the book. You need to use, something there. And then short and out. In other words, it's not a place for socializing and conversation. There's been a request that it be discussed. So it means that it's uncomfortable for somebody. Uncomfortable for somebody by us means uncomfortable for everybody, okay? So we want to make it comfortable for everybody. So if you happen to sort of have the feeling that that's sort of like the general library, it's not. It's the women's library. And, try to keep that in mind. It's a little non-intuitive because it's right there, so it feels like it's everybody's library, but it's not. Okay. So now we go to finishing up. Have you been looking at the slides? Have you been using them to see what you're missing? The idea of the review is that I tried to summarize everything we've done so you can look at it and decide what's missing, go back and fill in what seems to be missing, and be able to hold together everything we've said up until now. Have you been looking at the slides? So look at it, okay. So I'm going to go briefly through the last two topics. Um, I think we can do it briefly because we spent a lot of time on it. The first is probably the single most important issue in family therapy. It's the one that clinically you run across all the time, and that's triangles. And the point of triangles is not that people talk to more than one person. You know, the idea in families is not that people talk only face-to-face. The point of, and we're talking about here, is that it's possible for any two people to have a discussion one with the other that starts with I positions, right? And that continues without bringing somebody else in. Now, if you think about siblings, it's pretty easy to recall. I was, I think, about 40 when I realized that every time I speak with my brother and my sister, I always talk about my parents and not about us. So I decided, having taught this stuff for 10 years, it's time to put it into practice and to talk with them face to face, but not about my parents, because we were just triangulating. We weren't talking about our relationship. It's a simple matter. Maybe some of you agree of it, maybe some of you notice it. Now, there were triangles that are not such a big problem, right? As siblings talk about their parents. But when it becomes that's all you talk about, and you don't talk about the face-to-face relationship that the two people have, that's when the triangle becomes too comfortable. Add the word regulating to that, right? In other words, you're just regulating the relationship, but it becomes an obstacle to creating new things, because it's hard to create anything new about somebody else. The new things are created between the two people who are talking. So what we want to do is to notice when triangles isn't a foul, it's not a red card or a yellow card. Triangle is an obstacle to co-creation, to mutual relating. And so you'll find families where they naturally tend towards triangles, and you don't have to take an axe, you know, and go at it and say this is family pathology. But you sort of gently say, okay, right now, how about just the two of you talking? It could be a father and a son, and the wife is always having something, you know, you see that the couple is regulating their relationship around what they do with the son, and the son doesn't talk to his father directly, so you just say, would you mind sitting with me, the mother, and let's have a father-son thing. Because father-son thing is a separate value in its own right, it's a subset of co-creation. It's a subset of what two people could do, and the third person is a interference. Not a willful interference, not a bad interference, but an interference. Now, the limiting triangles are mostly those that cross the generational lines. If you recall, that's where we talked about what in family therapy we refer to as a perverse triangle, where it crosses generational lines. And we learned there that when it crosses generational lines, it works like a double bind. In other words, it limits people in a more severe way, because this is the way that I suggest that you summarize it for yourself. That the child participates in a content message. In family therapy literature, the word analogic was as opposed to digital, and that meant content. So just translate it as content. The child has a certain message that's with a content, and the content expresses his need for authority. Right? We talked about hierarchies we'll talk about hierarchies in a minute. The child needs parental authority. It's not that parental authority is enforced on the child. The child needs it the same way that a yeshiva bocha needs a rebbe, right? You need somebody above you. So the child needs that. But in the perverse triangle, the child is expected to be disloyal to one parent, which means to disrespect the authority of one parent, which means that in order to have authority of one parent, he has to not have authority of the other parent. So you have a contradiction there between the content and the process. The process is, what's the process? Put it in your words. The process is, it's good to know what the word process means. It's all of family therapy is about process. The process is, you remember the one that we talked about, the example that we used from Sefer Bereshit, your father, right? So the process of, that's a content, put on hair, fool your father. The process is to remove yourself from the authority of a parent, right? This is how to do it. You put on the hairy skins, that's a way to do it. But what you're doing is, obviously this is not the pshat, we're just using that because we all know the names. You're using it to go around the authority of your father, but you need the authority of your father. Why are you listening to your mother? The process of why you listen to your mother is you need a parent. So I'm a parent and he's a parent. So the process is one that contradicts the content. The content is go fool your father, but the process is you have to listen to parents, because why should you listen to me, right? That's a relationship. The process is the way a relationship is. Listening to parents, but doing something that involves not listening to a parent. There's a contradiction between a process and a content. People tend not to notice the contradictions between process and content. People notice the contradiction between content and content. Go fool your father, go don't fool your father. Okay, that you can see the contradiction. Go fool your father because you need to be loyal to a parent. That's where you get what's called the muddle. People don't notice it. It's not that they can't notice it, but they tend not to notice it. And then it becomes something that's hard to speak about. You say, but how do you put it to terms? Wait a minute. Why should I be loyal to you if I shouldn't be loyal to him? Children certainly don't think that way. And so, if you see, you say, I said to this amazing group of bright and postmasters, developed the individuals, what's a process? And the answer was, that's hard to put into words, right? So in families, people don't use language to understand process very much. And when they don't, they miss it. If you can't use language, you can't think about it. So you feel that something isn't right, but you can't think about it. That's the role of the therapist. The therapist is enough removed from the process to say, I see a contradiction, and now we have to figure out what to do about it to try to get you out of it. But if you don't get out of it, then in a natural way, the double bind works because you can't quite say what's the matter, but you can't leave, and you can't protest because you can't quite say what it is. So you sort of dumb down your relationships. You limit your relationships. You limit the co-creation. Right? Co-creational moment might have been when Yaakov would have said to Rivka, because he was presumably a pretty bright guy, there's a content, there's a double bind here. There's a content and process contradiction here. What do we think we should do about it? And the answer would probably be, we're following a divine direction here. That's a human question. We're not here in human discourse. That would have been a good answer, right? And then everybody could be part of it and say, well, we don't understand why we're doing it, but it's things that human beings can't understand. If you see it as a human process, then you would like to be able to say, why should I listen to you if I shouldn't listen to him? But you see that that's a very unusual thing that a child would do. Sometimes adolescents do that, and we're heading to adolescence very shortly. Did we get through analogic, content, process, the double bind? Does this sound familiar? When you get to it in the clinic, the first thing that you'll notice when you're talking with the family and this is happening is that you feel confused. You won't get it. It's not like, this happens and you say, there it is. The first thing that will happen is you say, whoa, something's confusing me here. That's a very, very important sign for a family therapist. When you feel confused, probably what's happening is a muddle and there isn't language within the family. And then you go back to these slides saying, could it be a perverse triangle that works like a double bind? Now I think I see what I'm saying. That you usually do in supervision. It doesn't happen at the time, but if you come out of a session saying, I feel confused, that's very good. That means that you're getting something. Now, the last thing that we're doing, which I'm afraid I thought that I translated and I didn't, but the terms, what Venusian did which is the most popular way of thinking about families. So we don't want to skip over it, but we want to try to understand it. Minuchin imported a different way of thinking about general systems. The importation was not about human systems, and therefore it has some limitations. But the main notions that Minuchin teaches us to think about are boundaries, hierarchies, and subsystems, right? People who use Minuchin tend to confuse the boundary with the hierarchy and say that there's a boundary because the father tells you to do something, so you do it, and that's a boundary. That's not a boundary, that's a hierarchy, right? A boundary is not a limit. If you remember, a limit is something that's done one-sided, and a boundary is created on both sides. In the United States, up until recently, the boundary with Canada and the boundary with Mexico were boundaries that were created on both sides. Somebody decided it should be handled as a limit, and we're seeing some of the limitations of what a limit does instead of a boundary. But the idea of a boundary is that it's created together, which would mean that the child listens to his father because he wants to listen to his father, not because he has to listen to his father, because he needs a father. But the father has to be a father who is applying the hierarchy in a way that provides developmental nutrition, right? In other words, the father knows what kind of hierarchy and what kind of boundary the child needs. Otherwise, we have to correct from both sides. If you correct only from the side of the child and say, look, you have to listen to your father no matter what he says, you're going to limit co-creation. Co-creation is not a bad thing, because when you have a kid and he's 1 year old, you don't say to yourself, what I'm doing with him now is what I'm going to do when he's 21 years old. Something has to change, right? And what changes is not only developmental theory. Developmental theory is what you learned with Barbara for the first semester, right? So you know in categories what has to change. But what has to change for this particular child, that I need to learn together with the child. So if I need to learn it together with the child, what helps him to develop this child, and what helps him, what inhibits his development, so then we're working on it together. So parenting is a learning process, and the person you learn from is your kid, each particular kid, and as a result, you're dealing with co-creation, even though there's a hierarchy. Co-creation doesn't mean there's no hierarchy. Co-creation means that people co-create from positions that they're in, right? So if we think of Minuchin as giving us those three terms, what we saw is that all three terms break perverse triangles. Remember that? In other words, if you say, why am I doing this? Why am I moving these chairs around? So, I'll deal with a subsystem. Why am I doing it? And the answer is, if you look at it, when you apply hierarchy, you break the perverse triangle, because a perverse triangle means that there's a bond that crosses the hierarchical boundary, like Rivka and Yaakov. There's a hierarchical boundary that it crosses. If you go back to hierarchy, you break the triangle. If you say they have to be subsets that function, so the subset, the parental subset that has to function is Rivka and Yitzchak. And it's not functioning, so we get the subset to work. We get them to talk about who's going to get the bracha. Right? That apparently was a conversation that didn't need to happen in that way. But, in human terms, you say, well, figure it out, you're the parents. So that conversation would be about the subset, having the subset function, parents thinking together about the welfare of their children, but the reverse triangle is broken by it, right? And the same with the boundaries around the subsystems, that the boundary around the subsystem is that the parents talk and the kids are outside of that subsystem. That boundary breaks the triangle. So if you look at Minuchin, it's a way of thinking about more than three, but it always comes down to breaking central triangles that are perverse. And the last thing is that the people who use Minuchin give a lot of privilege to the terms hierarchy and boundary, and very little privilege to the term subsets and the subsystems. And what we're trying to do here is to do that a little differently and say the subsystem is what has to function. What is the function of a subsystem? Co-creation. right? The function of any subsystem is that this should be mutuality, and it's better for everybody if they can co-create who they are and who they're becoming, right? So the function of a subsystem is central, right? What supports, what makes the subsystem able to function? A boundary around it that's functional for that subsystem, and a hierarchy that's functional for that subsystem, right? So the primary goal is the function of the subsystem, and that's the ends. The means are the boundaries and the hierarchy. That's a different way of looking at Mnuchin than Mnuchin himself. But if you look at it that way, it's easy to work with Mnuchin. But the goal is to see the subsystem work. The way to get that to happen might be to move some chairs around, tell one person to talk and somebody else to shut up, try to reassert hierarchies. But when you do that, the point of it is to see if you get a subsystem to work. If it starts to work better, then you're not thinking at the time, you say, oh, I probably broke a perverse triangle. But you're getting the subsystem to work. Yeah.
So in order for boundaries to work, you have to have mutuality.
Right. Well,
It can't be
right. In other words, let's say
unilateral.
parents want to talk, right? Now, there are Mnuchin freaks, and there are people who use Mnuchin. Don't become a Mnuchin freak. Although it's very easy to be a Mnuchin freak because they just tell you what to do and just do it, right? But a Mnuchin freak would say, when parents are talking and the child has something to say, shut up, stay out of it, right? Because what? Because I have to have a boundary. I have to have a boundary. So you say to yourself, when the child in the room has a comment here and there, and the therapist lets it work, and the parents let the child have something to say 3 times, and the 4th time they say, we are trying to talk, and when you keep interrupting, we get a little confused, so how about if you be quiet? And you say to yourself, look at that. The subsystem is creating the boundary. You don't have to do the boundary to make the subsystem. The subsystem is able to create a boundary with the child. That's where the mutuality is. They're doing it. And it's functional. What does that mean, functional? That the kid shuts up.
The child has to agree to it.
What's that?
You're saying the child has to agree.
With the child, if the child doesn't agree, then it is not yet functional.
Right.
But when the child agrees, in other words, when a family creates its own form of boundary. Now, there's a range there, isn't there? Like some families, the child will pipe up, and the father will give him a patch and say, shut up. Hierarchy, right? And the child will say, okay, that works, and the parents will continue to talk. So it worked. So who are we to say how it has to be? It works. And there are other families where it's number 8. The 8th time that the child pipes up, the mother says, listen, sweetheart, here's a comic book, and or in common Israeli culture, here's a pad, watch a movie, and quiet down, and that works. The biggest problem with Mnuchin, that was heavily critiqued by the women in the 90s, was that he decided what a boundary was. He said, this is a good boundary, because the boundary was primary. And they said to him, you're bringing in your own culture. That's how you were raised in Argentina. Beseder, but not every culture, because you're dealing with blacks and Puerto Ricans, or maybe Haredi Jews. Not every culture is the same as your particular culture. There's a broad range of how that's negotiated. And so we're adding a question of how does it work in this particular family? And that gives us room to see. So you sort of say to the parents, do what you need to do to be able to talk. So you give them privilege to the function of the subsystem. And then they create the boundary with the kid. That means we're not imposing our view of what a boundary has to be.
I'm not clear on the difference between the boundary and the hierarchy. What determines something?
Right. Well, you see, there are boundaries between, for example, both parents are members of 2 subsystems. There is a member of a subsystem whose function is to be spouses. It's a couple subsystem. And they're both members of a subsystem called the parental executive subsystem, right? Now, why are they, it's the same two people, so why do we talk about a boundary between subsystems? Because they're two different functions. That these two human beings, this man and woman, both are engaged in a couple relationship and in a parental relationship. But in principle, those functions are going to be, they can be conceptualized separately. And in many families, people try to keep them separate, right? So that when you're talking about your relationship and you're talking about your children, you keep one outside of the other one. Now, there also, you'll see that in some cultures, the boundary between those two, so there's no hierarchy there, right? It's the same two people, right? But you'll see that in some systems, parents will, a couple will talk about themselves and their children and themselves and their children, and you say to yourself, it's a pretty fluid... Huh? What? Did I say something wrong? Oh. And it's pretty fluid, but it works. And in another family, it'll be fluid, but it won't work because they keep fighting about the children, and then they forgot that they're really fighting about, who's doing the dishes and not about the children and so forth. So you see, there's no hierarchy there at all. That's not the issue. Hierarchy is a separate issue. Yeah.
I just thought of a recent example in my family of boundaries, which I'm happy to share if it's helpful, but if you don't have time.
What's that?
I said I have a personal example of boundaries that happened very recently with my daughter.
Okay.
Which I'm happy to share, but if you don't have time, then we can move on.
Okay, so there's a
After
question.
the class.
Here is a live example, not about a client. Because, that's how it is. You're learning about therapy. So we ask our group, is this comfortable for everybody to hear about this example?
I think it should be on the blog.
What's that?
I think it should be on the blog. If it still exists.
You think it should be on the
It's not
blog?
going to go on the blog. Sorry.
No, but that comes from Doug Elephant. He wants the blog. Good.
You're trying to give me homework.
Right. But is it okay if we take an example from Maria's family? Because that will give us something alive. You're asking for examples. Yeah.
Just, is a boundary, is it the rules? Is it the rules that define the way some system works? Like one family, the boundary would be like, when parents talk, kids don't say anything. And another family will be, the kids are asked to talk maybe 3 times. Is it the rule itself?
Right.
Is that how?
So there's an interesting matter of
You'll see
rules.
from my example, you'll
Right.
see.
Okay, well, let's talk about rules for a minute, and then we'll get to the example, and we'll see where it works. Rules, good rules come from within. In other words, they work, right? Rules are sometimes like in dotted lines, let's see if this rule works. When you say the rule is the rule because the rule is the rule, you sometimes lose contact with reality, with a particular family that needs perhaps to change the rules. But the rules are co-created. The more the rules are co-created, the more they can be adjusted for different kinds of people at different kinds of ages. The more the rules are the rules, because those have to be the rules, then the less flexible they are. Now, obviously, there are certain rules in every family or in every culture that are just the rules, right? When the parents close the door to their bedroom, nobody opens it. That's a pretty acceptable rule, except for little children who get accompanied out, and you figure it out with them. But that's a kind of a rule that you assume works for most families, and it's confusing if it doesn't work. Confusing for the parents and very confusing for the children. So that would be an example of a pretty common rule. But can you speak while you're eating? That's at the table. Let's say you've already swallowed, so it's not sakonis nefashos. So you swallow, and then you want to say something, but do you need to ask permission to say something at the table? There's a place there where you can say, how does it work? How does it work in this family? And the rule may work that you ask them, and it keeps things, very orderly, or it's a way that nobody talks about anything because nobody wants to ask permission. So you ask how it works. So when you talk about rules, when you talk to a family about the family's rules, and it's a good idea to talk with the family about the family rules, you say to yourself, rules, put it in, in the quotation marks. These are rules. How do they come about? Can you test them? Can you look at them? Can you change them? Is there room for procreation? And if not, why? Which is usually the previous generation. Let's hear the example and then see what we've done about rules from that.
Yes, it's very specific to...
And the comments can be invited to the blog.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, now I have to check the book. So it's very specific to my 14-year-old daughter, and it wouldn't apply to my other kids. So she likes very much to be in contact with me and my husband, and she likes to share a lot and talk a lot, and she likes to be very close. So it happens to be when she leaves the house in the morning, she gets the light rail, and then she gets a bus from Yad Sarah to Baivagan. So she will call after she's left the house about 3 times, like 5 minutes later, and then a few minutes later, and then, and I realised it was getting to the point that it was a bit ridiculous, and I started...
Wait, we're just going to translate. A bit ridiculous means you didn't like it.
Meaning, yes,
Okay.
I felt that it was too much.
Okay.
Yes, my personal...
But no, see, this is important, because how does a mother know that something isn't good for the child? It doesn't feel right.
Right.
And then the mother says to herself, or her father, doesn't feel right to me, or the fact that it doesn't feel right to me because I'm her mother means that I'm having an intuition that it's not right for her. Which is something that you talk about when you're dealing with a family. You always bring up that question, because that's a subsystem question.
Anyway, so a few days ago, I think she was calling a lot, and I was busy in a different room getting my little one ready for school, so I was just kind of ignoring the phone, and I thought it was probably her, but I decided it was best to ignore it, to let her kind of learn how to be more independent and let go of it. And then in the end, my husband answered the phone because he'd come back from shul, and it happened to be that there was a chafetz rashut, and she'd had to get off the train and wait and get a different bus, so she was actually a bit frightened. So afterwards we talked about it, and I said, because you call so often, it's a bit like the boy who cried wolf, and we're not going to take it seriously. And she really got it, and I said, it's better if you limit your calls to when it's really important. And so when she left the house this morning, she said, I'm only going to call if it's an emergency. So we'd kind of established a boundary between us that works for her and me and my husband. And whereas let's say
your hope is going to work.
We hope it's going to work,
right.
but she upped it. She realised that it was getting too much. Whereas, let's say my 17-year-old son, if he called me, I'd be delighted, because he doesn't call every day, and I don't always speak to him every day. So, he doesn't need that boundary.
Right.
So what would it be called if your daughter didn't agree with the setup?
What?
Like, what if her daughter's like, no, I still want to call you 3 times a day? So
Okay.
she's not
Well,
gonna
let's-
answer.
3 times in half an hour.
Right.
Let's talk about what did work, and then talk about what might be different. And then, since the example is adolescence, we'll use that as a
But
way
she's
of moving into
someone that you
adolescence.
can talk to, and
Right.
she listens, and so we kind of worked it out together, as it were.
Right. So first of all, if you
Is
say,
that a good example?
right, you say, is there a rule? So the answer in Maria's family is that there is not a rule about when you call. There hasn't been a rule about when you call, and each child uses it as developmental nourishment. In other words, sometimes a child will need to get some sort of a self-object presence from their parent. So, they need a little wind in their sails, and so they call about absolutely nothing except to get wind in the sails. Every parent knows that. That's not a bad thing, right? And then you say to yourself, what's the developmental cost of needing winds in your sails from your parents? What about all these other people around you, your teachers and your friends? And are you using that in a way that inhibits you from doing other things? And then there's a third thing, which is how much you intruding on the home. In other words, how much is a child calling in a way of saying, I'm present, don't forget me, right? And I need to have my presence at home because I'm nervous about what happens at home. That you didn't say that, but in another family, I need to call to find out about you, not to have you, just you say it for care, but I'm checking to find out if everything's okay with you. So this is an interesting developmental issue, right? In other words, how much a child needs to feel that the parent is thinking about them, and how much the child needs to be thinking about home. And that, in principle, 14 years is a pretty common time when that reaches a certain transition point. Now, the transition point, and there were no rules here, right? This wasn't a rule. This was a way of going about things. A way of going about things in Greek was called ethos. The word ethos means how people tend to do things. And so there was this ethos. This is how the family more or less did things. And mother had a feeling that something needs to change. And then the question was, how is it going to change? Now, in this particular case, how could it have changed? It could have changed by mother saying to the daughter, let's talk about what you feel when you call me. That doesn't happen in real life, that happens in therapy. But no, just for the sake of argument, say, listen, you know, I like to talk to you, but as your mother, I wonder if you're needing to talk to me. Now, it occurred to me, maybe you think I need to talk to you. That's what's called fakir. We're going to get the paradoxes, right? That maybe the child, not in your family, but in another family, the child is calling the parent because the 14-year-old daughter is saying, if she's the youngest of all the children, which she's not, I think mom is feeling alone. No more children at home, and so I'll give her a call, but I can't tell her that, so I'll tell her that I need her, but I think she needs me. That could happen, right? It's not a horrible thing to happen. So here, what happens is mother is feeling that it's uncomfortable. It hasn't reached a point of communication, right? In other words, you thought about it, thinking about it. You see, everybody is thinking about how it is and how it might be. We have a word for that, don't we? That's called mentalizing, right? When we think about not just how it is, ethos is how it is, mentalizing is how it might be. So you think about reality, and you think beyond reality to what else might be happening. Something that adolescents tend to need help doing, right? So here we have a 14-year-old who is not mentalizing about how she might not call home. It doesn't occur yet to her, it occurs to her mother. That's a mothering function, and if we look at a mother-daughter subsystem, so within the mother-daughter subsystem, something is probably is ripe for change. You see, you could say something is pathological, or you could say something's ripe for change. It depends how you see it. I suggest ripe for change. Most of the time, seeing something is ripe for change is better for making change than saying, oh, now Maria has revealed this horrible codependency between her and her 14-year-old daughter, and it's really quite a fadicha here to hear about it. We're all uncomfortable, but you know, and you know, or we could say something's ripe for change. In other words, that this is how things get ripe for change. Now, the conversation didn't happen, but you know, Israel, and particularly Jerusalem, has this weird way of creating security crises, and that is an interesting issue because sometimes, I hope we don't go through this again, but you know, in the early 2000s, in the second Intifada, nobody turned the cell phone off. You know, we used to have, I used to do seminars in Jerusalem, some of them were at Hadassah, and the deal was that everybody's phone was on because you never knew who needed to call about what was, you know, some sort of security risk. And the deal was that once you heard the third ambulance, because Hadassah, you know, there were ambulances, but when you heard three, everybody called their kid. Everybody called their kid, because there was no way to manage the anxiety. So that's, you know, an Israeli, you know, kind of thing. So here we have a chefetz chashud. Now, where on earth, except maybe London every now and then, does everybody have to get off of the light train because of a chefetz chashud? That's the specialty of the Middle East.
She's also probably also,
what's that?
Subconsciously, I think she's also very concerned about this girl, Oriane's Bacher, you know, that's another underlying tension.
Okay, so maybe you discovered that she was calling because she thought you were worried about her, and she needed to let you know, well, not you, but you bring it up, but then it doesn't become personal, it becomes, some family, that there's anxieties about the security of our children. And in families where children go to the army, that's a very severe Israeli developmental passage when a mother hears from her son when he's in the army. There's just nothing like it anywhere else in such huge proportions in the population, but when that happens, then the son needs to be doing some other things, but he also is minded about the fact that his mother is plutzing, right? So here, this is plutzing light, but taking the light rail, once is one chayfetz chashud, the anxiety level goes up everywhere. And then, so you can imagine how this chayfetz chashud could have lowered the differentiation in the family, right? You can imagine, and this is how these challenges happen. You have a 14-year-old who has to get off the light rail with everybody else because of a security risk. And then the discussion is, why do you call only 3 times in a half an hour? You need to call every 5 minutes, because every 5 minutes something could blow up. So, and then things get worse instead of better. The chayfetz chashud has lowered the level of differentiation. Instead of the mother and daughter talking about, you're 14 and I'm busy with other things and I don't forget you even if you're 14 and you don't call, that conversation doesn't take place. The security risk becomes a triangle, right? And now we talk about security, and you can understand that when you're dealing with security, the security becomes a triangle that diminishes the ability in many families to talk directly. In this family, and in 10% of families, dealing with crisis raises the level of differentiation. You won't see those families in therapy. Sorry. They'll have something to teach you, but you won't, they don't need you, right? But the other families need you to do exactly that, right? Now in your family, you see you didn't answer the phone, right? And then your husband answered the phone, and what turned out was that she really needed and you really needed, because maybe you heard on the radio, blah, 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 right? So that could lower the differentiation. Say, oh no, we're not, just keep calling, let's have a live streaming, or whatever. Or what you did is you said, you see how this works, and you see how it is for you and how it is for us. Now, how it is for you and how it is for us, is that regulatory or intersubjective? Intersubjective, right? How it is for you and how it is for us. See, the comment, when you call all the time, then we don't know, that's not Musar, it's also Musar, but it's an intersubjective statement that makes it hard for us to know how, if it's happening all the time, it makes it more difficult and so forth. So this security risk created an intersubjective moment, and intersubjective moments are moments of co-creation. And in this particular case, if you look at the mother-daughter subsystem, the fact that your husband answered the phone did not intrude into the boundary around the function of the mother and daughter who were able to talk about it. You see how you can use these notions to talk about health, not just about pathology, right? And so there was this co-creation that took place. And so the security risk, boop, you gained something from the security risk. That happens sometimes. If it happened all the time, Israel would be Gan Eden, because we have all these security risks, so everybody would be, intersubjective. It doesn't work that way in many families, and that's exactly, you see the point? Now, your daughter's 14, so now we're gonna not use your daughter, but 14-year-old girls, and say, oh, well, what is the transition that happens with 14-year-old girls? There's a 14-year-old girl here who is used to talking to her mother, right? That wasn't a rule, that was an ethos, it was a habit, right? And is she going to be doing that when she's 45? Right? There's going to be a transition at some point, right? When would be a good time for that transition to take place? Well, what does the girl have to gain from not talking to her mother? What's that?
Talking to other people, managing.
Say it again.
Talking to other people, managing her own
Right. In other words, if her talking to her mother is inhibiting her relationship with her friends, then she's losing something from it. But maybe it's not, right? So why should she call her mother less when she's on the way to school? She doesn't call in school all the time, but on the way to school, why would she be calling her mother? And why might this this need to change? So let's have a look at adolescence and try to figure out what we can learn from this. Do that, do this, and this, and this. Now, the first thing that I want to talk to you about is something that has certain terms that are unfriendly to the Haredi community, but friendly to human development. At the time of physical puberty, she's a young adolescent, right? 14, until about 16 we talk about, well, let's say 12 to 14 is young adolescence, 14 to 16 is middle adolescence, 16 to 120 is late adolescence, and she's in the middle between early and middle adolescence. One of the most important things that we've learned about adolescence is about early adolescence, about the period of puberty. And this is something that was learned. It's something called the Brent Center. The Brent Center is a continuation of the Anna Freud Center. Anna Freud Center deals with children, and the Brent Center is a breakoff of it and deals with adolescents. There's a couple called Laufer and Laufer who have created a series of publications from the 80s on, where they tried to look at what's called developmental breakdown in adolescence. And you see, we can use your daughter as an example of what has not broken down, or what might break down, right? Now, the notion of developmental breakdown is, by the way, breakdown doesn't mean like a nervous breakdown. Breakdown, I believe in British English here, it means like a car breaks down. It stops moving, right? That's the point of the breakdown. It's not everything falls apart, but there's a stopping of movement. Their notion is that around the age of 12 or 13, children ask themselves, can I become an adult? They start to think about the future. They look at their parents, for example, and they say, can I get there? Is there a path from here to there? Can I become a functioning adult like my parents? A functioning adult is somebody who's responsible for their own feelings. A functioning adult is somebody who takes care of their own world of work or learning and of love. We would probably add is capable of emotional intimacy, and certainly the issue of sexual maturity. Right? That's when you start to be pubertal, your body is somehow the let's deny us. There's big news here in your body, and you say to yourself not just where is it coming from, but where is it going to? Is this something that I can bring to maturity? Because it doesn't make you mature. Sexual puberty is something that you can bring to maturity, and it usually is a challenge, and according to the Laufers, it's a challenge of about a decade until you sort of figure it out. That's in British culture and Haredi culture, where people often get married. Within that decade, it might be a little sooner. So the issue is, how do you get there? How do you say to yourself, I'm bringing this now sexually mature body, how am I bringing this to adulthood? How am I bringing it to become as adult as my parents? And the notion of breakdown is that in some families, the child says, I can't do it. I don't see the horizon. I don't see where that's going to happen. I don't think I can take me and this new sexually mature body and bring it to maturity. It's beyond me, right? And that is where that's where you have the breakdown. In other words, the child says, I can't be an adult. I guess I'll have to stay a child. Okay? Now, the sexual part of it is important to understand. Obviously, it's in a completely different culture. But the way that they saw it is that the way that young people imagine sexuality, talking about fantasies, the way that they imagine sexuality doesn't really begin with adult sexuality. In other words, you have a pubertal body, but you're not imagining sexual relations as what will ultimately be mature sexual relations. You're imagining sort of like a kid, and that grows over time. And the point of this way of looking at it, which obviously in Haredi culture you don't have to figure out what to do with this, but it's something that happens in another culture alongside, and it's an important insight because you meet people and it's helpful to understand this, is that you can't imagine getting to mature sexuality. So you sort of assume that you're gonna stay like a kid. Their notion is that there's a central fantasy that grows over time. They call it the central masturbation fantasy. That's because it's talking about men. It doesn't have to do with physical masturbation. It has to do with fantasizing what sexual relations might be. And if you think about how children, you have this body that now can work, and you say, what do I do with it? So a 12-year-old doesn't know what to do with it, right? A 12-year-old assumes that you do something like you did as a kid, right? And over time, the imagination grows to, it might be something, here's where we might use the word mutual again, that you can create something that's adult and co-creational and mutual. The children who don't know confidence in themselves stop moving. They say, if I can't get there, I can't get anywhere, so I'm not going to bring myself to maturity. But I can't afford to stay a child, because as you know, if you ask a 14-year-old girl what is the most obnoxious, despicable thing that she can imagine in the universe, it's a 13-year-old girl, right? In other words, adolescents can't look back. They have to be moving forward. So they can't say, well, I'm going to go back and be a child, right? But they can take the childish part of them and become a pseudo-adult. And a pseudo-adult is somebody who is broken. I'm an adult, but I'm broken. What are the tracks that a broken adult can be? Drugs, promiscuous sex, violence, crime. In other words, things that you say to yourself, I'm taking drugs, I'm an adult. Most of the kids who are taking drugs not to be an adult. That's not true of everybody, right? But it's true of a lot of kids that, the idea of drugs is, I'm big, I'm drinking. I can take a shot of whiskey, and I can take 2 shots of whiskey, and if I take 3, I'm really an adult. And you're horizontal, right? But that's an adult, and hopefully that's not the adults that he sees in his family that are always horizontal. So, but that's not an adult who's growing. That's a broken adult. And another track of being a broken adult is what we refer to as some kind of, in the DSM or the PDM, mental illness. In other words, an eating disorder is often a way of not becoming an adult. Most of people who deal with anorexia see it as girls who are developmentally breaking down. And it usually begins around puberty. And if you look at the boy side of it, the male side of it tends to be more acting out than acting in. And so instead of depression and anxiety, you may get, sort of so-called criminal behavior or, pushing the limits. But if you look at those kids and say, are you going anywhere with this? Where is this going? Is this going to get you to be an adult like your parent? And the answer is, I can't get there. Now, you can't ask it that way. It takes a while to get to know that with a kid. But that's what this is about. It's about being a broken adult instead of a functioning adult. Yes.
So, just if I understand correctly, so there's a developmental way of becoming adult,
right?
And then there's the maladaptive way of becoming adult, and that's the story that means if a child cannot become adult through the adaptive way, so then it will attach itself to maladaptive stories that say I'm an adult,
Right.
but that doesn't really make them into an adult.
Right. I'll give you an example. A school, let's take a girls' school, right? It's a little bit imaginary, but there are 2 different girls who come to the headmaster and say, I don't think this school is run right. One girl is 16, and she says, could I speak with you about my experiences as a student here? because there's a certain way in which you talk to the girls which doesn't help me to develop, and I have some suggestions about how you might be able to, I understand I'm still from the child side, but I'm tracking it, and there may be something you may be missing. Now, that's a little like science fiction, but some of you people may have been girls like that. They sometimes become therapists. So, you say, what's that?
That's my 14-year-old.
Okay, so
Again.
the daughter says, I have some thoughts about this family, right? There were ways in which we could develop better here. And let me share these ideas because I think you need to know them. Now that is that oppositional? Yeah. Is this a girl who thinks she knows more than adults about something? Yeah. Is it a girl that's on the way to being an adult? Yeah. In other words, she's making a point about how the adult world isn't right. This way, here's the adult world, and she's growing towards it, and she's talking to it, right? Another girl comes to the principal and says, you people don't know anything. You people don't know how to, you don't understand children. Sometimes happens in families too. You people don't know how to do anything. This is all wrong, this is terrible. So that person is not growing. She's staying a child. You people are the big people. Right? I'm not one of the big people. I'm an oppositional little people, right? I'm not becoming one of the big people. I'm shooting missiles, but from the bottom towards, but I don't imagine myself being responsible. And so you say, aside from it all being wrong, if you were in my shoes, what would you do? And they say, I don't want your shoes. Parentheses, those shoes are big on me. I can't even get to those shoes, but I can shoot at them, right, from below. So you see that the attitude of adolescents to adults may be we're growing, right? And that's what an adult would want to foster. And it may be I'm not growing and you're no good, right? Which is being a child who's oppositional to big people but not becoming a big person. Yeah.
What causes that?
Oh, we're about to get to that, right? So there's multiple causes. Yeah.
It was interesting. I had a client who died. She's 23. I only saw her twice because but she said,
Hold on a second. A client who's 23, a client we don't need permission for. A client, right?
oh, okay, but no, I'm saying it because she said that one of her things she wanted to talk about is she didn't feel like she was an adult.
Good.
She said it straight out.
So you see, the lovers
And she's like the young.
give you a gift, right? The lovers say, now, there is no other way to really conceptualize it except the lovers. Everybody else sort of kind of missed this. If you think about identity, she's not talking about identity. She's talking about, if you ask her, when did you start to think that you weren't going to get there? You'll go back probably to puberty.
So is it like a confidence, a skill thing?
What's that?
Is it like a confidence, skills, like she's
No,
the youngest in her family?
so this
is that
gets
part
back to
of it?
what Gabriel was asking. And so let me just add one more thing, and then when you're a small child shooting up, but not growing up, shooting up and not growing up, that works for drugs too, right? Shooting up and not growing up. So then you're in an Oedipal situation. What does that mean, an Oedipal situation? Oedipus was a little kid, and his father was the grown-up, right? The whole idea of Oedipus is that you're dealing with an adult and a child. The Oedipal situation is a 3-year-old kid, right? Now, the 3-year-old kid, what's his problem? That he can't win. He's small. But he also doesn't want to win, because who wants to have a 3-year-old father? So the Oedipal situation is you're small and somebody else is big, right? That's a marvelous situation, marvelous, because somebody else is responsible for everything. It doesn't get you everything you want, but it does give you the possibility of being a child who complains but can't get to be like the adult. And as you know, the solution of the Oedipal complex, which is pretty natural, is that you start to see that you might become like your father. Freud said, when you get to 5 or 6, you say, well, I won't take my father's wife from him, but I can be like him. That was a fantasy that comes a lot later, but logically, it's a kind of a solution. So now, the adolescent who's breaking down is an adolescent who is preserving the Oedipal situation, which means shooting up and not growing up, right? There's always somebody above you. And the solution in normal adolescence, and this is a very important point for your client as well, the lovers say, when do you know that you're mature? When do you know that you're an adult? And Their suggestion is that you know when you're an adult, when you could forgive your Oedipal parents. What does that mean?
And you what?
You can forgive the Oedipal parents. It means that you can see it from the other side and say, you did your best. Not so great, but you did your best. That's who you were. I'll do better. That might be wonderful for you too. But I can see that you tried and that you were doing your best when you were here and I was here, right? You can only do that once you're up there. You can't talk about Oedipal parents from below. The only thing you can do from below is to shoot at them, right? And complain about them. Or be overly dependent on them, right? When you get up to the point where you feel as mature as they are, then you say, I got it. I got it. That's what it's like being a parent. That's what it's like having kids. It ain't easy. You weren't great, but I got it, right? In other words, I'm at the same level. So when your client is saying, I don't feel adult, you might say, and how do you feel towards your parents?
Yeah, but that's how they're defining parents. Like when I asked her, like, what does adult look like to you? She said, like, you know, handling things. Like, why does it, who said that's the only definition of adult in a real child?
That's the one way, there's no only in this room, but that's one way of looking at it, right? So is she saying the adults are here and I'm down here? Why am I down here? Now it may be that she's developed a dependency, and now we get to one last thing, which is Gabriel's question of how does this happen?
She was the youngest in her family and your baby there. So.
Okay, so how does this happen? There's two aspects of it. As you've probably been listening, you might have been saying to yourself, hey, I'm in the wrong room here. What is this? Of course, in psychoanalysis. What are we talking? We're talking about families here. What are we talking? All this Oedipal, Schmanipal, you know. Well, what would make it difficult for a child to grow up? One of the reasons that children don't grow up is that their parents need to stay up, right? In other words, the parents are having difficulty managing their adolescent transition, because there's no such thing as an adolescent. There's an adolescent family, right? And managing the transition is no less of a challenge for the parents than it is for the child. The child needs to grow up. The parent needs to change the parenting completely. To become a parent of an adult means that you relinquish being the Oedipal parent. Oh, there's nothing better in the world than being an Oedipal parent. You're God, with a small g. You know everything. This person's dependent on you. They think that you know everything. They actually think you know everything. They do what you tell them. And you know, if you need to, you say hierarchy, but they jump. And so it's an enormous challenge to human narcissism to relinquish that. There's something about being a parent that, now, if a parent themselves has had trouble in their own adolescence, and so they need to stay the Oedipal parent above the child, then the child may feel shooting up is better than growing up. Shooting up in this family works better than growing up. Is that imaginable? If you think about regulation, that if I keep shooting up, right, I keep messing up, what does it do to my parents? Oh, they're running to therapists, they're taking care of me, they're still, you know, trying to be that perfect parent. And they come to therapists who say, you know, you really are wonderful parents to this awful kid. You know, this kid is messed up. And then we, instead of the PD, and we use the DSM and say, fuck. You got a kid with an anxiety disorder, you got a kid with a social disorder, you got a kid with an eating disorder, the kid, and you need to learn how to take care of your kid, because the kid stays down here, right? And the child feels the family is better off this way, because my parents still need to be up here. They can't feel up here if I'm up here too. They need me to be an Oedipal child, so there'll be an Oedipal parent. And what will I be? A broken down adolescent. In other words, an adult who's broken, right? So you can see that might service the family as a kind of a regulation. And there, what you'll end up doing is shutting down co-creation. In other words, nobody will be talking about how can we help you to grow up. So that conversation that that Maria's daughter had with her, right? About can I grow up, right? It's about growing up. It's about having a mother who says, I'm fine with you not calling me, right? And if you start to grow up, we can renegotiate our relationship. You will still have a mother, but you will have a mother of a 14-year-old instead of a 13-and-a-half-year-old, and then you'll have a mother of a 15-year-old, and so forth. So you see the difference? Whereas if some other 14-year-old would have said, you see, Israel is dangerous, I need to call you more often. Now, why do I need to call you more often? Because I need to shoot up, because I can't grow up. And the mother would say, you know, you're right, Israel's very dangerous, and so you really do need your mother every 5 minutes. And so you created a triangle, and the family has regulated itself down to a lower level of differentiation because there's closing down of co-creation, and the child will not be able to grow up. So you get the idea? There's a chapter that you can read from the Laufers. Does this make sense to you? Is this something?
After that, you can read from where?
From the Laufers, the Laufer and Laufer. The
When
first.
was that written?
What?
The Laufers, when was it written?
The Laufers are still writing, but 1985 was a book called Developmental Breakdown in Adolescence. That's a book that if you want to treat adolescence, aside from all the other stuff which everybody knows what to read, you have to add that to the reading list because it's an important point and it's an easy point to connect with families. They don't do it. Not everybody does everything. They don't do it, but we can easily do it.
I'm wondering how exposure to sexuality affects this whole puberty development, because you've got kids that are abused when they're younger, and you've got high schoolers in America that are already having to have sexual relationships in high school, and you've got grade boys who have much of a less, exposure to it.
I only got part of the. How does sexual abuse affect?
No, I'm just saying, how does exposure to sexuality, because you said that they have
Exposure to sexuality.
like they have this idea of what the sexual might be, and it
Right.
varies depending on the
Right.
culture. And
But we don't know the answer to that. Obviously, in this room, the answer would be the less the better, because they're too immature and they get this strange sense of sexuality. And if you look at sexuality in pornography, it's mostly childish sexuality. There's no expression whatsoever for mutuality, let alone emotional mutuality. There's no expression of two people creating something together. So pornography, if you want to, you could say that's like, shooting up instead of growing up. But that wasn't your question. The exposure itself, nobody knows the answer. In other words, if you ask the question, not axiologically, what should it be, but empirically, what happens? So as you know, every generation of parents says about their kids, this is terrible. The sky is going to fall if this continues. This is absolutely horrible, and the technology is what's ruining our kids. That happened in 1840 with a new invention that adolescents took over, because technology always goes to adolescents in the market. That invention was called reading. In the mid-1800s, there were trains that were crossing Europe. They took a long time, and there wasn't much to do. At the same time, the cheap printing press was available, and so people started, like Dickens, to write, by the word. And Dickens was a good example. There's all sorts of garbage being printed, and all of the parents of the mid-1800s were talking about the fact that the children are not working with their hands, they're not sewing, they're doing this horrible thing which is going to ruin their minds called reading. So things change over time, right? And we don't know, but if you can think about it, this technological change often creates a triangle. And then instead of saying, how are we going to live in this world? What are we going to do with it? How are we going to help them to grow up with this? We just say that they can't grow up because they're exposed. And that isn't so great for differentiation. We're going to go to the following, one second. We're going to go to the following task now in groups. What I want you to do is to think of a question that you want to ask each other. It's time for you to start to become. Growing up, right? We have this going on in education too. This has been not the easiest lesson. It is not so simple. And so when you speak in dyads, think what you want to ask the other person and work on that for about 10 minutes or so, because I understand that some of the women's groups needed more time to talk as a group as well. But the question that you ask each other is the question that has come out now as you're growing up with this material. And Nathaniel, one last question? Yeah.
I'm just curious, in our culture, if this thing is not only the Oedipus complex and the breakdown in development, it sounds a lot like people's, and I don't mean to be derogatory in any way, but it sounds like a lot of people's released minds. I'll say I'm talking about myself, how I view rabbis, or how I did maybe, and how kind of you push them up. And kind of it's almost a breakdown of the relation of, it's a developmental breakdown. It's not, they're not human beings. They're push them up in a hierarchy, and whatever they do, often, even when it comes, you see sometimes, rabbis, sexual allegations, like abuse allegations, and different things,
Right.
push them up and kind of push yourself down. Even with let's say help, or a less extreme situation, a rabbi in the chassid or whatever, or even just a rabbi in a congregation.
Right. So Nathaniel's bringing up an extraordinarily important question, which each of us can ask ourselves. Maybe that's the good target. When I was an adolescent, aside from my parents, who was enormously influential on me, and did it help me to grow up? Did I use it more to shoot up than to grow up? There's a huge responsibility there when you deal with young people, because it's awfully enticing to replace the Oedipal parent with an Oedipal rabbi, right? And then you stay, and it doesn't help you to grow. That's human foible. It's one that needs to be overcome. But that's
Is that a cultural issue or an individual perception?
both, like everything. Yeah.
Then why
I
is
just wanted
it?
to say,
What?
in developmental psychology, they teach,
Yes.
just about the breakdown, what may cause a breakdown. Even according to Erickson or Freud, if you miss one of their stages, developmental stages, that can cause a breakdown in becoming an adult.
Right. If this were a course in psychoanalysis, that's what we would do. We would say that the adolescent brings with him the previous experiences that then explain the breakdown. If you look at families, things are a little bit more plastic than that. In other words, the idea of developmental theory aside from this was that by the age of 3, you're cooked. It's all over, if you were 2 and something didn't go right, that's it. It's going to be pre-Oedipal, it's going to be dependency. If you were 3 or 4 and something didn't right, that's it. You're going to be stuck with some sort of castration complex and there's nothing much you can do about it except for an 8-year psychoanalysis, which probably will begin when you're 16 and finish when you're 24. Now, there's nothing the matter with that way of thinking about it, but it's partial. In other words, that gives you some aspects of it. Erickson, was a genius, so he created this thing that was like a general systems theory. It explains everything. But these days, we all know there ain't no such thing as a general systems theory that explains everything. And he missed families. He got to everything he got to just before we started to understand about families. And now as we understand more about families, we also see more how families can change things. Or how, when you say, when you were 2, this got messed up, and so you have to work it on yourself. Well, maybe, but maybe it's messed up in a cycle in your family. And if you co-create in your family, you can overcome that in a different way, right? So that's a very important question that you're bringing in. We haven't quite got to it yet, but that's one of the reasons we think about family therapy with adolescents, because if the adolescent can work through with their family and the family can help the adolescent to grow, the adults are also growing with them, and a lot of the stuff that should have been stuck turns out to be a little less stuck. Okay, so now this question that Nathaniel raised, is that okay that we raised that question? So it's not my question, it's your question. It's a very important question about high school, right? It's an important question about what education is and who influences who and whose responsibility is and how that works in the Haredi communities. We're not going to talk about the Haredi community, that's a little silly, but the Haredi communities, the different communities that would overall fit into the Haredi framework, how does that work? That's an enormously important question. And hopefully part of the reason that we're here is not only to give an answer, because we don't have an answer, but to work on the question. That's, I'm glad you brought it up. And that's where the blog can come to life again. Okay, off we go.